Welcome to a little further information on Sonnet 29. By now, you've read the sonnet over. You've played maybe with some of the icons on Glogster to get a little background information, but let's start again. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets. The first edition came out, obviously, as you can read here, in 1609. It's part of what's called the Fair Youth sequence. Now, this particular sonnet is called a Shakespearean sonnet because of its format. It is made up of 3 quatrains and finishes with a couplet. Now, to review a little bit, a sonnet has 14 lines. It's written in iambic pentameter. Usually, its topic is love. And the title is either a number, as per the collection, or the title will be the first line of the sonnet. And now we'll move on to slide 2. Well, here we are together again. Now, there are 3 types of sonnets. Petrarchian, which is the first type of sonnet because it was invented by Petrarch in Italy. And we know that a Petrarchian sonnet is broken up into an octave of 8 lines and a sestet of 6 lines. Our second type of sonnet, which we're going to discuss here, is a Shakespearean sonnet. And as we just noted, it is made up of 3 quatrains and a couplet. Our third type of sonnet, which is probably the most difficult to write and actually is the one that is considered truly an English creation, was created by Edmund Spenser. And in that case, his is really more centered on the end rhyme scheme as it goes back into quatrains from above. But for now, we're going to actually talk about a Shakespearean sonnet so you can understand a little bit more about how it's put together, how it's structured, and its end rhyme scheme. Now, the 3 types of sonnets, Petrarchian, Shakespearean, and Spenserian, the way we differentiate is by the end rhyme scheme. And the end rhyme scheme is the sound of the last word in each line. Now, Shakespearean sonnets are broken up into what's called quatrains, and a quatrain is in essence a 4-line stanza. So here we see, very visually, quatrain 1, 2, 3, and the couplet. Now remember, a couplet is a 2-line stanza. Although it's written all together in a consecutive 14-line grouping, as you read it, you want to be mindful to break it up so that you're actually, as you're paraphrasing or as you're going to interpret, you understand that there's a fluid motion throughout the poem. Now, the end rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean sonnet, which is the simplest type of sonnet to write, is AB, AB for the quatrain 1, CD, CD for quatrain 2, EF, EF for quatrain 3. The couplet is GG. Very simple. Now, if you notice on our slide here, you'll see how they can break out in understanding or interpretation the 3 quatrains into 3 different segments. So I might have beginning, middle, and end, a thesis, and I have 2 examples, past, present, and future, morning, noon, and night, and obviously you see here birth, life, and death. But there's another one. And one we also can consider that's not on the slide, but you might be interested in. It's where I present something as not what it is. Then in the second quatrain, I present what something definitely is. And then the third quatrain might be what the thing actually does. So there are other ways of looking at this and interpreting it. Last but not least is the couplet. And here, couplet will do a couple of things. The couplet can almost stand on its own as an idea or an entity. It can be an observation. It can be a summary. It can be a conclusion. It can be a universal statement that you could apply and be applicable. The couplet usually is considered a closed couplet, which we also know is kind of a heroic couplet. And we know that that's a couplet that can stand completely on its own and be pulled out. So to review, our sonnets, we identify them by end rhyme scheme. Number 2, there's 14 lines. and we want to be confident of our organization and how it's broken up when we go to understand it or to explicate it. Moving on. Well, welcome back. And here's a copy of our poem, and we're going to look at it and analyze it. We're going to look for things like diction, obviously organization. We're going to look at what our speaker is talking about. We're going to look to find where is the poem's turn or shift. Now, we haven't talked about that yet, but that's where a poem, as you're moving through it, actually takes a decisive change. And the change can either be positive or negative. It could be the antithesis of something, but there's always in a poem somewhere where there's a shift or a turn. We're also going to look in terms of tone, the mood. What kind of atmosphere is this poem creating? As we spoke before, identify our speaker. And remember, the speaker is not necessarily the poet. So if you were writing a poetry explication, you don't want to say the poet says, you want to say the speaker says, or the speaker feels, or the speaker indicates. So, now look at our title, Sonnet 29. Up until now, our 29 has been written as a number. But notice here, it's a Roman numeral, and many collections are actually presented this way. So it might help you to know your Roman numerals if you're just given a title looking like that. So we're going to start our poem. Let's look at our poem, and we're going to follow along with our little pointer. Our little pointer says, when in the disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deft heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate. That's my first quatrain. Now, if I was reading this poem, I would read it and I would notice how many references, and I've highlighted them in pink, throughout the poem, that the focus is on the speaker's self. All alone, I, outcast, myself, my fate, me, myself again. All this inward focus that he's very involved in himself. But let's go back and look in that first quatrain at alone and outcast. That's evidence of alienation. And as we've spoken before, alienation is a theme. And alienation comes in two different forms. To be alienated by others or to alienate oneself. The beauty of this poem is he's not specific, so it could apply either way. So this poem could work for anybody depending on their state of mind, whether it was thrust upon them or it was something they chose and their results came from their choosing. So we know that this speaker is feeling alone. We also know that he has talked to deaf heaven with bootless cries. In other words, he's turned to heaven or otherworldly forces, and he's basically not getting any answers. And there's a certain feeling of resentment there. He's also going inward, and he's cursing his fate. Notice the word fate. Fate. Was it preordained? Was it something that just came out of the blue? We really don't know. Now our second quatrain, let's read that. Wishing me like one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoyed contented least. First quatrain, his state of mind, how he feels. The second is taking it to another level or depth. And this one I think is so applicable, not only back then, but today. How often do we feel despair? Or how often do we feel disconnected? And after we're in that immense feeling of sadness, sometimes can generate anger, where we compare ourselves to others. We look at others We feel envy. It builds our despair. Now, I think the interesting words in this stanza, or quatrain, or second portion, are art and scope. Art, very interesting word. This doesn't refer to painting. This refers to skill or ability or what some man is able to create. And we don't know again. What was it? Was it a piece of art? Was it a piece of writing? Was it a piece of business? Who knows? But the fact that he's comparing himself to what someone else has created or someone else's skill or ability. And then he uses the word scope. I love this word. This is an interesting word. A scope. What does scope mean? Scope can mean the magnitude or the breadth of something. But scope, think of an assassin's rifle. He uses a scope to zero in. So is he still referring to what this person was able to achieve? Or the scope, what came maybe from that achievement, or what someone's accomplished, their reputation, or money they have, or notoriety. So he's comparing himself on so many different levels here. And what is he saying? With what I most enjoyed, contented least. Now this one, I love this line. I personally relate to this line. You know, I have children. When my children bemoan their fate, what do I say? All right, I'm sorry for you. But then I yell at them and I say, get out a piece of paper. And on that paper, you better find the things that do matter in your life. And they'll say, I have nothing, nothing. You all have something. To find something, but that initial inclination to say you have nothing. You can't even find joy in what you do have, and there's something there. This is so real. It speaks to us as humans. So now we have two stanzas, and in both stanzas, the tone, the mood, we feel his despair. We feel his pain. We feel his agony. And we start to move into the third stanza, the move, the flow. And then he goes on, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. Oh dear. When you feel your negativity and then you go that one step further and you feel even worse because you know you're being a bit of a whiner, maybe. And maybe it's justified, maybe it isn't. But this whole cycle is feeding on itself. It's the cycle of despair. But then, what happens in this next line? What a key line right here. We're going to look at happily. What a shift. I think on thee. Thee. I note that in blue right there. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. There's my ship. My transition happens in the third corner. Not quarter. Third quatrain. Excuse me, that was bad. But we'll correct ourselves there. It's the third quatrain. And we will keep moving on, because mistakes can happen. Let's look at that word thee. And this is where this poem is gorgeous, because he doesn't center on a specific thee. That thee becomes a thee of choice. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's your mother. In my case of my children, it should be me, because I'm the best thing they have in their corner, and they better happily remember that. But, that thee could be someone from the past. And he says his state, like the lark, that beautiful little bird. See that little bird there? That lark. And Shakespeare loves larks. He loves marlets too. Those are good omen birds. Those are joyous birds. Is going to sing happily at heaven's gate. So I've got my heaven not listening in the end, but him finding his heaven himself. Emphasis here is he found a way to center himself. He didn't have to go outside. He found something to break him out of his despair. The thee. Who's the thee? Well, we can all choose. Last but not least, we move on to the last couplet here. And the couplet, again, summary, conclusion. And he says, for thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that I then scorn to change my state with kings. In other words, he has a kingdom of his own, and a support kingdom, and something that's going to sustain him and take him away from the doldrums of his despairing state. Now, sweet love remembered, that's in blue too. That's important. Because it's saying the love doesn't have to be there, or whatever it is, doesn't have to be present right now. It can be remembered. And the beauty is you have the ability in your mind, with your memory and your feelings, to take you to something that's beautiful, to help restore you. This is a gorgeous poem. This poem works on so many different levels. This poem speaks to you today as it spoke to people back then, that you have the power within you to restore yourself, no matter what your problem is, no matter what your obstacle is. Shakespeare is magnificent, beautiful. Thank you.